Thank you very much, Bhavana. And good afternoon to all of you in Oman, in the Middle East, Europe and Africa, and good morning to those of us in the Americas, and good evening in Asia. Welcome to this session of the MENA Energy Meet. My name is Phillip Cornell, as we just heard, and the moderator for today's panel discussion. We'll be talking about repurposing the oil and gas industry to navigate the energy transition. The oil and gas industry faces increasing opposition from a public that's greatly concerned with the environmental impact of fossil fuels, more skepticism from shareholders, and challenges from policymakers seeking to simultaneously meet decarbonization goals and expected oil and gas demand. Amidst the global energy transition, the demand, financial and social future of oil and gas companies is increasingly in question. But of course, oil and gas remain an important part of the energy mix, especially in developing regions. Even the most aggressive decarbonization scenarios show an ongoing long-term role for oil and gas, but those dynamics are clearly changing, and the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated that change. So the challenge for the oil and gas industry is to both engage and adapt to a changing policy and investment landscape, maintain and build value, but also to evolve in ways which don't just support, but contribute and perhaps even lead efforts to decarbonize the energy system. So to discuss that challenge, I am delighted to welcome our esteemed panelists today. Kate Dourian is Regional Manager for the Middle East and Gulf states. She's responsible for supporting the member countries in the region and developing and strengthening relationships with national and regional stakeholders. Before joining the council, she worked at the IEA, where she was program manager for the MENA region and was previously an energy reporter and editor for Reuters, Platts, and the Middle East Economic Survey. Stuart Broadley is chief executive of the EIC, the Energy Industries Council. The EIC is the UK's largest energy supply chain trade association. It's a not-for-profit with 650 member companies across oil, gas, power, nuclear, and renewable markets that advises governments and boardrooms and has helped companies grow at home and around the world. Prior to joining EIC, Stuart enjoyed a long career leading global O&M businesses in oil and gas, power, and renewables with Rolls-Royce, Wood, Senvion, and Horbiger. Waddah Ghanem is chairman of the Energy Institute Middle East branch since 2018, and he is also senior director for sustainability, operational, and business excellence at the ENOC Group. That's the Emirates National Oil Company in Dubai. In his capacity, Waddah is responsible for overseeing the development and implementation of best practices and standards for EHS, business excellence, quality, sustainability, security, and risk management, and also serves. He also serves as the vice chairman for the Dubai Center for Carbon Excellence. So we're really delighted to have such an esteemed panel here today. Let me start with a broad question to all of our panelists to get things going. Starting maybe with Kate, what do you see as the most critical tool or tools that the oil and gas industry has to lead rather than just follow the pace of the energy transition? Kate, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Philip. I think we are in we're facing a period of uncertainty. We're in uncharted waters. All assumptions have been sort of thrown out the window. We've seen demand destruction for oil more than gas. That is unprecedented. I think there is uncertainty as to when we will see a recovery at one point, when we will go back to even 2019 levels. There's been a lot of talk that we may have even reached peak demand, or that it's going to come sometime over the next decade or the next 2 decades. So if you're an NOC in the region, you have to consider all these changes as you are developing your policy. I know, for example, the UAE is now developing its energy policy to 2050. I think it's very, very difficult to do that given the uncertainty. Yet, as you say, oil and gas are going to be a part of the energy mix despite the decarbonization. So I think the challenge for the oil producers in the Middle East is how to decarbonize, not just oil, but gas. There is technology. I was in Saudi Arabia earlier this year in February, before the lockdown. And there is a lot of innovation. There's a lot of technology that is being developed. You know, CCUS, we've seen the first green ammonia export from Saudi Arabia. The technology and innovation are there. I think the message isn't actually getting through. These are big companies, the ADNOCs of the world and the PDOs and the Aramcos. They have the capacity to manage big projects. And I think that the challenge is how to transition to a more digitalized, decarbonized energy system, which the world is demanding. You know, it's demand driven rather than supply driven. There's not going to be a problem with supply because we've seen what's happened. We had a slush in energy, in oil supply, decline in demand for gas by about 8% this year, less so for gas, but even gas is under pressure to decarbonize. So I think the technology is there. I think it's how you mobilize this technology and become part of the solution as opposed to be a bystander and wait for events to actually force you to change. I think there is a sort of an early starter advantage, and the Middle East generally has it. Maybe maybe it started a bit late, but we've seen a lot of deployment of renewable energy. There needs to be maybe adaptation of the grid. There needs to be storage is a big problem, but the technology and the innovation and the desire, I think, is now there, which it wasn't some time ago. But at the same time, you're doing it in a very carbon constrained world. You're doing it in a capital constrained world. So I think the ones who will emerge in a better position than others are those that have fiscal buffers, who have sort of basically prepared for this rainy day. But we are in a crisis that nobody anticipated. We have seen demand destruction. We don't know. The future is very uncertain, but it's important to at least look beyond crisis and prepare now for a sort of post-pandemic recovery.
Thanks very much, Kate. So it seems like in an era of a lot of change, we have a lot of technology at our hands and big project management skills. Waddah Al-Hashmi, you have obviously been in a position at ENOC to think about these things. What do you think are the tools that we have?
Well, yes. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. I think I agree with what Kate has said. However, I want to probably talk about maybe three aspects of this. The first is the planning, which is obviously, as Kate said, extremely challenging. It's extremely challenging for everyone in the world because we don't know. It's the uncertainty. The only thing that's become quite certain is that it's very, very uncertain. And but we should have known this because the only constant is change anyway. So I think the cycles for the energy sector, and the way to deal with this is that the planning cycles need to be a bit more agile. So instead of doing annual planning or 5-year plans, you're doing 1-year plans with a 5-year outlook, and then doing closing the cycles and doing quarterly reviews. At least we're going to need to do that for the foreseeable future when it comes to what's happening with the COVID-19. The COVID-19 has shown us, interestingly. I mean, by the way, I just want to, but it was just very recent. My job has actually changed. I now look after logistics and marine assurance from sustainability, but I still do a lot of work around the sustainability. So that is fine. So, but in the Middle East, I think the GCC state countries, and because we are oil-based economies, our approach, I think, has been obviously that as Kate said, oil will remain there, and as we transition to greater decarbonization, I think the focus is more on improving efficiencies. The state-owned enterprises, like the state-owned oil companies around, are going through a transformation. In some places faster than others. I believe that the UAE is probably dealing with that transformation faster. They're looking at strategic thinking. They're integrating that with things like energy security and other aspects. And so the role of the government has been actually, I think, quite progressive in thinking about the change. But all the other GCC states also are moving quickly towards that kind of transformation. And so it's not really decarbonization pushed by a policy of decarbonization as such, but it's really on diversification and improving in terms of efficiency. So that's the first point. The second point, I think, is to do really with the business models themselves. I think that we've seen that for example, investing in solar and investing in alternative energy is something which is good, because it can support the carrying capacities that we need for the future growth and development in this region. I mean, the UAE, I mean, not prior to the pandemic and for years probably after the economic downturns in 2009 and 2015, we didn't see double-digit growth, but this region saw double-digit growth and still saw positive growth, and now we see that this region is starting to slowly pick up from recession. So we see that the diversification is not only good for economically, but it's very good sort of in terms of energy security and in terms of social. And the third point I'd like to say is that it is quite important that these industries do invest a lot in people, and I think the governments of the region are looking more and more at investing in their people as our populations start to grow, and we start. I mean, just to give you an idea, just in the UAE, I'm not sure of the stats in the other GCC states offhand, but in the UAE, for example, 85% of the population is below the age of 40. That's the indigenous population of the UAE nationals, and about 50% of the total population, about 500,000, are between the age of 20 and 40. This provides an exceptional opportunity to train people at quite a young age and upskill them for a future which is moving away from the conventionals, or at least moving towards technology driven kind of environment. And that's why you see probably the UAE is trying to invest a lot in innovation and technology and stuff like that. So I think it's a very, very interesting world that we live in. I think there's a lot of challenges, but I think equally there's a lot of opportunities. And I think for the Middle East, so the Energy Institute, and just to say something on the Energy Institute and what they're doing in the Middle East, is we are more and more from talking to our different member sort of companies and technical members and discussions with our membership. More and more are looking at and asking the question, what kind of skills, what kind of training, and what kind of knowledge and competence that we're going to need in the future. So I think it's going to be very important, and I think that it's very important for us, as I said, going back to the first point I said, that the planning cycles need to be shortened, they need to be agile, and we need to continue to think and research. Last point, collaboration, I think, is key. I think within all these industries, before maybe industries were able to work in isolation from each other. The aviation industry, the energy industry, whatever, the hospitality industry. Today, we saw in COVID, the most important thing is collaboration. And I think the energy industry needs to collaborate more with all the other industries, and not only industries, but academia and the policymakers, etc. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Waddah. So yeah, people are really at the heart of this change and how we sort of prepare them for that change. Stuart, what are your members? How do you see it from your point of view, and what are you hearing among your members in terms of the assets that are available to face these new challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Philip. And just to remind everybody, so EIC, which is the organisation I'm privileged to run, has about 20% of all UK energy supply chain companies in membership of some kind. Okay, well, I guess we're in the world here of energy transition is the question you're asking. Let's just talk a bit about that. So firstly, this is, in our view, an unprecedented time. It's a revolution, not an evolution. How often do you see the 30-year market opening up, which involves technology and the global markets? And that is what energy transition is, whether for you it is basic technologies like wind or more interesting technologies like hydrogen or even nuclear small modular reactors. It's coming. and it's global, and it's worth, estimates say, $2 trillion per year, every year up until 2050, and that would enable, in theory, the world to fully decarbonize. So what an amazing time it is. Obviously, we have COP26 in the UK next year, and so lots of people are now thinking about what are they going to say on that stage. So to sort of answer your question a bit about what are the tools that the oil industry has then to sort of position itself for this. The first thing I'd say is Western Europe is on average furthest ahead as a sort of macro region of the world. We took the Paris Climate Accord targets kind of, if you like, not most seriously, but very seriously back then. And for countries like Norway, well, all of Scandinavia and France and Germany and the UK have made significant steps already in decarbonizing our economy, particularly in the power sector. And of course, offshore wind, most famously in the UK, is now world leader, actually, has the world's #1 production of offshore wind. So I think the first thing I would say is for countries around the world that want to understand how to set up their regulatory system, their policies, legislation and funding models to do a similar thing, they should talk to the UK government or other governments that have already done it. Because the way to get your government to decarbonize part of their, their power sector, it's been established and proven, and it's now fully commoditized and industrialized, and it's a global industry. I'm talking here about wind and solar particularly. The second thing I would say that is why Western Europe? Why have we moved so fast? And it's actually, I'm going to say somewhat controversially, it's a balance of sentiment, standard setting, and economics. And some countries of the world, why do they make these big decisions? Perhaps because they want to kind of set a good standard for their people, or compared to the rest of the world. Some countries do it because they just wait for the economics to work, and some countries do it because the sentiment of activism or their people is overwhelming. And I think actually in Western Europe it was the latter that was the reason why we moved so quickly 10 years ago. Why now we're out of this first phase, which is sort of wind and solar, because we've established it, we know how to do it, we'll continue to do it, but now we need to look at energy transition phase 2, which is hydrogen, CCS, and so on. So I think that's the second tool to use is, turn to other governments that have done this and speak to them. The third thing I would say is that CCUS is now widely seen for those economies that are moving into they've done the simple power steps of decarbonization with wind and solar, and they need to go to the next step. CCUS for blue hydrogen seems to be the next obvious step, and that's kind of widely understood. And oil companies therefore will be well positioned to do that because it is kind of, using the methane raw product and then needing to store the CCUS. And the other kind of established next step is electric vehicles. So those seem to be the two macro next step globally to look to, whether you're an oil company actually or a government or actually anyone in the game of decarbonization. Beyond that, actually, I think what's the most interesting technology is green hydrogen, so electrolysis-based hydrogen. And there doesn't seem to be globally a real leader yet in that, and there's no kind of industry that says that's mine. So that's a very interesting multi-trillion-dollar opportunity over the next 30 years that no one has yet grabbed. So for those companies that care less about sentiment and more about economics, at some point, green hydrogen is there for you. But finally, and then we can go into the more general Q&A, I think if you are an oil producer right now, you have, in very simple terms, 4 things you can do to get into the world of serious decarbonization and to, if you like, green up your credentials for your stakeholders, your population or whatever it is, whoever the stakeholders you care about. First option is, as you're seeing IOCs do currently in Europe, you can try and be big in both oil and renewables. You can basically make the statement, I can do that, I can be big in both. And I sell off some of my oil assets in order to fund the growth into renewable investments. You can do that. You have a fundamental problem there, though, which is people will question your authenticity. And whether you're able to be good at both, and actually whether you're too expensive in renewables because you need the engineering side from oil and gas. And actually, if you look at the renewable sector, it's much less engineering. Or on the renewable side, you try and put that into oil and gas, and actually you're never going to find a renewable company saying they'll invest in oil and gas. Trust me. So they don't play nice, the truth is, but currently that's the most popular strategy. And Conoco, the latest one in the US just this week, to say we are now going to go net zero carbon by 2050, again, without a clear plan, but you can see the trend. So that's step 1. Step 2, and option 2, is you can say, I'm going to do it by decarbonizing my oil assets. And oil producers of course, are in control of that, and they can do that. But that kind of is step one of the ultimate, because by decarbonizing your own assets, you're still saying, but whoever buys the oil or the derivatives of oil, the indirect emissions from that is somebody else's problem. So some oil companies are actually saying, you know what, we'll be responsible not just to decarbonize our own assets, but also the indirect outcome of those. And that's a big step. The third option that oil companies have is to offset. To basically accept, look, we're an oil company, that's what we do, but we accept it's unpopular. So we will offset those emissions by doing the simple things we can do to address our own emissions, but also then we will do things like we will manage deforestation reversal. And so there are companies like Eni, for instance, who has made a big move now into the Amazon to look at reforesting the Amazon. And that's a direct offset and is actually a very important very important consideration. It's actually more authentic, you could say. You then get to say, I'm oil, but I balance it in a more direct way. But not everybody can do that, I guess. And there is a fourth option which oil companies can do, is they can stop being oil, of course, and they can do what the Danish oil and natural gas company did, known as DONG, and they are now known as Ørsted, the world's largest offshore wind producer and service company. And they went from 100% oil and gas to 100% offshore wind in 10 years. So I think tools at hand for oil companies, there are many and unbelievable choices ahead. I think one of the key decisions is about authenticity, actually, and what do you want to be for your employees and the society at large. But of course, it's very difficult for all companies to be authentic in the short term. They actually have to, they actually make the transition, make the journey. And of course, transition is different for everybody. Everybody starts from where they are in order to then get to their destination. And every oil company, every producer, every country starts from a different place. So the tools will actually be different for everybody.
Thanks very much, Stuart. I think you raised some really interesting points there. Let me just say first to the audience, we will move into a Q&A discussion here. Please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A chat box in your console. Stuart, I just wanted to follow up. So you described, for example, the big variety between the different approaches of oil and gas companies, and it seems to me that we're sort of dividing into some different regional approaches. So of course, Europe is very much on the forefront. You mentioned Ørsted. I mean, we can add Equinor and some others that have really used their expertise to advance, for example, offshore wind, and this sort of transition into BP is at the forefront of this transition into other industries. In the US, you mentioned Conoco, but for example, some of the other companies seem to be performing a real double down on fossil fuels and reaching for that efficiency, whereas in the Middle East, we're kind of diversifying inside the hydrocarbon sector. So there's clearly a geographical, let's say, changes that are happening around the energy transition. So given that some regions are further ahead than others, why do you think this is, and what does it mean for investors and for boards, please?
Well, I think that was why I was touching on sentiment versus setting standards versus economics. And I think that's the main reason why it's a different approach in different regions of the world. And in Europe, sentiments mattered most, even before economics and even before that sense of we will show the rest of the world the standard we set. And some countries work like that. So it became a sentiment very much driven from effective activism. That activism firstly focused on shareholders, and then it focused on governments, and finally society. So the Greta Thunberg and many others, it was successful in Europe, and it really worked. And now, the reason that oil companies and EPCs and others based in Western Europe are furthest ahead is because actually it's the survival of those boards and CEOs and chair people. Their jobs are based upon them making an effective transition because their shareholders and their societies and actually their families now demand it. And now they are definitely in the lead because they are moving fastest. Now the destination for them is set through these kind of 30-year targets of some kind of net zero carbon goal, which they're almost all now committing to. But the journey, the steps to get there is undefined by all of them. And you mentioned BP. Yes, BP is kind of the spokes business, or even Bernard Looney is the spokesperson for the IOCs right now, but really all of them, including BP, are just on the first steps. And the truth is, for most investors, this energy transition talk, which is kind of hydrogen CCS, that money is still years away. For most of the investable projects, wind and solar and the circular economy globally is still the vast majority of the market potential, and that's where I would point them.
Great. I think Waddah Al-Hashmi is going to have to leave for a board meeting in a few minutes. So maybe, Waddah, before you go, maybe I could ask you quickly, how do you see, for example, in the Middle East, the approach to this, particularly given that there's a role for oil and gas in these national transformation programs, and what do you see as sort of the long-term approach that you're taking there?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much, and sorry, I do have to leave. I think that as I said, the role here is that the oil and gas resource is extremely important for this region, because it is a developing region, and it needs to sort of invest and fund into but that doesn't mean that we cannot invest a lot into decarbonization, into technologies, into efficiencies, into solar power, into other kind of research, where and I think that's what the government is doing. It's diversifying in the region, all of this thing. The opportunity, as I said before, is in developing the people in order to be ready for those jobs, as opposed to have a lot of people who are working indigenously in this region who have that have other competencies, and they need to be sort of reskilled or redeveloped or retrained and stuff like that. So there is an opportunity, and I think you will see a lot of change happening in this region in the next probably 5 years, not even 10 years, and this might be accelerated also by COVID. I think that traditional oil and gas will decline. We're going to move into other areas. I think even in terms of oil and gas for energy, but oil and gas also will be invested in into sort of more downstream, more petrochemicals, and more trying, I guess, more sustainable petrochemicals, and we'll try to produce energy from other ways, like, for example, waste energy. I think about a week ago, a new the first waste energy plant was sort of commissioned here, I think, in Dubai. So there's a lot of very exciting things happening in this part of the world, and I think you're going to see an accelerated change, definitely in this part of the world. But definitely, and again, as you said, Philip, people are truly at the center of this, and I think it's going to be challenging, but very exciting times as well. I want to thank you, and sorry, Philip, I really have to go, but thank you very much, and to my fellow panelists, Kate and Stuart. So all the best, and everyone else. Thanks, Philip. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Waddah, for joining us. Kate, maybe you can follow a little bit on Waddah's comments. You know the region extremely well. You've spent a lot of time here. Obviously, given that some companies might be looking to transition out, but some companies' strategy is really looking at who's going to pump the last barrel. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what do we see as the outlook for the Middle East in the context of producers and energy transition, and what do you see to be? Will there be, for example, a feast before the famine that I've heard about, given that market share might grow there, and how does that affect the outlook when we think about energy transition?
Thank you. Yes, and Waddah made some good points about the youth bulge and the need to create jobs. And of course, the jobs are no longer in the traditional, oil and gas industry. It's more in new tech. It's in digital, and I think because you have such a young population in the Middle East, it's actually easier to sell them the clean energy story. But to go back to the Middle East and the oil and gas producers, I mean, this is all happening at a time when they are trying to diversify their revenues away from oil and gas. As for maximizing their production now, I think, no, we've seen those really steep cuts by OPEC and OPEC Plus, maybe Russia, which isn't that concerned with price, because they have this $40 threshold above which they pour money into their investment, their sovereign wealth fund. I think Saudi Arabia was at one point seen as fighting for market share with Russia before the US intervened, but it was more about the timing of a production cut. So I think they want to keep markets of course, they want oil to remain relevant in the energy mix, despite the decarbonization effort, which is a long way away. I mean, when you talk about hydrogen, you're still talking 2040, maybe 2050 before it's deployed at scale, before costs come down, before you can actually, determine policy. I don't think there's a sort of a clear policy as to, do you go for blue hydrogen with CCUS? Do you go for green hydrogen, which is what Saudi Arabia is doing in NEOM at the moment, but that also implies that you're going to need to manage intermittency if you're going to scale up your renewables. I think, Stuart, you mentioned wind power, but that requires a lot of steel. And I know that, for example, in the Emirates, they have the big CCUS project at Emirates Steel, but not elsewhere. Industry is still going to need the heat content that is provided by fossil fuels. We've seen Dubai, yes, the UAE's gone into nuclear, they've got renewables. In fact, they lead the renewables deployment in the region, but they've also got coal. Saudi Arabia is producing more associated gas, but when OPEC production cuts come in, they start burning more crude for power generation, because they don't have enough associated gas, because associated gas has come down, which implies that the grid is not flexible enough to accommodate. So I think it complicates the transition for the Middle Eastern oil and gas producers, because they have to generate funds. So one way of doing it is you've got carbon taxes, you remove subsidies. They've all done it in different ways. Selling part privatization of Aramco is one. To raise revenues, to stimulate the non-oil sector, but that still requires oil prices to be at a certain level. Investing more in downstream, including petrochemicals, but again, demand there could shift if you ban single-use plastics, so there's uncertainty there. You've got maybe potentially sort of too much investment in downstream, in refining, which you're now competing not only with the United States as an oil exporter, but also with China, which is investing in petrochemicals and products. So basically, how do you, there are capital constraints. The IOCs are sort of pulling back from these mega oil and gas projects. So it falls on the NOCs to actually find ways of generating the income needed to invest in these new projects. So you can sell assets, part assets, like pipelines, as the UAE's done. You can privatize, part privatize. You retain control of the assets. I know Oman is thinking, has got a few assets in mind that they might offer to private investors. But ultimately, if you can shift carbon taxes into renewables, into that space, you create more jobs, you facilitate a faster transition. But at the end of the day, I think there's still, there is still, if you speak from a producer standpoint, they're still looking for oil and gas to be part of the energy mix for decades to come. And that requires investment in upstream capacity. And where is that going to come from? You still need those billions of dollars to invest in upstream capacity. And there is now a reluctance by the international financial community to invest in carbon intensive projects. So I think it is a dilemma. It is doable, but I think the time, it's going to take a lot more time, because storage is still an issue. Policy, it has to be policy driven and consumer driven. But I think in the Middle East, it's more, it has to be more policy driven.
Thanks, absolutely. And we are very much dealing with a capital constrained environment. I mean, those continued investments into upstream oil and gas, for example, we've seen big commitments recently from Saudi Aramco, have to be very welcome in an industry where we see production declines, all things staying steady, of about 8%. So we need to constantly tread to keep our heads above water in this industry. Stuart, Kate mentioned, for example, the difficulty of accessing that kind of financing outside of, for example, an NOC context, where there might be something of a war chest to draw on, and the difficulty of accessing capital, particularly for private and Western companies. Clearly, a lot of institutional investors and funds and banks are committing to very strict sustainability requirements. So how can the industry make sure it's on the right side of those commitments, and at the same time guarantee that it has the right access to financing to maintain the investments that we need?
Well, firstly, I don't think it is globally the case that oil companies are struggling to, or projects are struggling to get financing. I don't think that's a global situation. So I think, and I also think that Kate, you touched on the fact that that some companies, some projects are not going ahead, and that's true. But at the end of the day, there are enough projects going ahead right now for the demand in the market, and as the demand goes up, those projects will definitely be financed, because it is, as investors know, an important part of their portfolio on a global basis to have high margin, high dividend investments. And the oil industry will continue to continue to provide those project opportunities and finance opportunities into the marketplace. Now, you will get, of course, some investors, and this is what I'm saying, the sentiment that's happened in Western Europe, very specifically Western Europe, not the whole world, has driven a faster move towards a balanced approach. So an oil company has to demonstrate a commitment over a long term to decarbonization, and then the financing is made available. But in most parts of the world, that's still not required, actually. But I do agree that I think it will come. I actually think this is why it's kind of have the oil companies in Western Europe gone too soon or not? Because the share price is record low right now, and you could argue that's because they went too soon, and shareholders are now confused or concerned. Investors are like, well, I know I said I wanted you to do it, but I didn't want you to do it without having a plan of, how you're going to again get me money the other way. So, I mean, to try and answer your question, I think the reality is that firstly, it depends where you are in the world as to what you do. Secondly, it depends on what you believe in as a board, or, as a ministry, as a government, as a country. What do you believe in? So if you really believe that you have a kind of national belief in decarbonization as the priority instead of wealth, then that becomes clear, and that's what you do. But actually, if you actually believe that actually what is more important, for instance, is jobs creation, skill creation, in-country value, then it's more of a mix of technologies and skills and opportunities that need to come in to provide those opportunities. And this is what I mean about what transition is such a fascinating subject, because every country, every company, every individual starts from a different place. And so there isn't a single answer of this is what you all have to do. It actually is different for everyone. But I actually think that, that perhaps the final point on this is the multiples right now on renewable projects and on energy transition projects are really high. It reminds me a bit of the .com time, where for projects that are up and coming, in the green space, there is a lot of money to be made right now. There's just not enough projects. And now, of course, the oil companies are piling into bidding on all those projects as well. So even more demand, even higher prices for those projects. So I guess if you want to play in that game and you have assets to sell, then you probably want to be in the green space right now. But over the long term, actually, of course, it is about a portfolio approach. Oil stocks are still a critical part of that process over the next 30 to 50 years. And it depends where you are in the world. And don't forget, when, say, an oil company says, I'm now going to sell off 20 or 30% of my oil stocks to fund moving into the green space, somebody buys those stocks and somebody else benefits from that discounted oil stock. So it doesn't go away. It's not like it's a net reduction of oil production in the world. It just moves.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that's that those are all very good points. And when we see capital constraints in places like the U.S. shale patch, it's a very different environment when we're talking about large scale upstream in other parts of the world. We're just rounding out the end of our time here. So maybe I can ask you both very quickly before we go. Stuart, you talked about sort of the political environment and how that very much shapes sort of the strategy that's happening for oil and gas companies. Obviously, we're facing a very big political event tomorrow, at least here in the U.S. And so I wanted to ask you, how could the next 4 years or the medium term oil market outlook look different under different political scenarios? Tomorrow, but also generally in terms of how things are going, sort of post crisis from a political perspective. Kate, maybe do you want to start with that?
Sorry, yeah, I was going to say that I think we're going to see a slowdown in oil demand. I think we're going to see a shift I'm going to plagiarize and quote a speaker from a conference the other day that I attended. And it was basically that we've converted all demand into bandwidth, so that a company like Zoom, which we're on at the moment, which was unknown and not worth very much, is now more valuable than Exxon. So I think that's sort of an indication. And the fact that we're doing this on, virtually, is an indication of just how disruptive this pandemic has been. And I think the focus in the future should be on resilience to withstand future shock. And I think Waddah said it quite well, is have shorter cycles, scenarios with maybe a look ahead to 5 years ahead, rather, because this is actually a structural change. It's not just cyclical. So you can't just, all our assumptions that we used to base our modeling on in the past have disappeared. I mean, you were at the IEA, exactly, we use the data. But if you look at the latest IEA World Energy Outlook, they focus more to the 2030 period, not so much beyond, because of the uncertainty. And I think that's going to complicate things. But at the same time, I think there is a realization, and COVID has brought it into sharp relief, that we can get cleaner skies, we can get cleaner waters, that we can, I'm in the UK, and yes, we have a lot of wind and we're far further ahead, but we like that, except that we know that we cannot shut down the global economy in order to get that benefit. So the way forward is to find solutions, collaborate on innovation, on technology. And I think the World Energy Council is a place where you can do that, because it is an energy community. It is a global community, shared experiences, how to do. So I think that is really the way forward. It's complicated, but it's together we can do it. And also bear in mind that, we talk about, it's not a war on carbon. It is actually removing carbon from the atmosphere, or preventing more carbon from getting into the atmosphere, because CCUS and all of that may allow us to get to 2 degrees, but that's not good enough. So I think we need to find ways to produce energy cleanly and make sure that those who don't have access to energy, you've got 815 million people without access to energy globally, 3 billion, 3.5 billion, or millions more, hundreds of millions more, who don't have access to clean cooking. So you can't leave them behind, and you can't impose on them and say, you can have a light bulb that's produced from solar, but you can't have a car. It's a difficult balancing game, but so it has to be affordable, it has to be clean, and it has to be accessible.
Stuart, how do we look at the political environment going forward?
Absolutely, yeah, thanks. And I agree actually almost with everything Kate said. I think it was spot on with lots of things there. So I'll just not duplicate and just say, I'm going to say controversially, I don't think the US election, from the point of view of the short-term environmental impact, makes much difference. No matter who gets in, it's not going to massively change the US shale impact on the world's economy. And there's, they're not going to make a significant economical impact to environmental opportunities to investors in the US. And US investors don't care much about sentiment. They only care about economics. I simplify. So therefore, I don't think the US election has a significant impact as much as we would like it to, specifically to this topic. But what I do think is, in the end, what always talks is money. And I think ultimately follow the money, right? And so what's very interesting now is phase 1 energy transition. So wind, solar, and circular economy, we reuse, recycle, is now a massive global industry, highly commoditized and industrialized. And there's huge projects around the world with high multiples. So don't get distracted as investors into hydrogen CCS, even though for a few countries like UK, we're ready to start looking at it from an economics point of view. Most are not. So that's the first thing. And secondly, finally, and this is big politics, COP26. So it's just a year from now, exactly, where all 100 plus heads of state, and let's hope the heads of state of the US are there too, will come together to Glasgow in Scotland, beautiful Scotland. And we'll have a chance to pitch to the world an aligned, if you like, new version of the Paris Climate Accord, because I think COVID and everything else that's happened has brought a new sense of urgency. And combined with the wealth opportunity of these kind of utility scale decarbonization projects that everybody's looking for to get people back to work and jobs moving, plus the general stakeholder view that we have to decarbonize, I think it is a unique time. And I think that COP stage may be the time where we see a rare opportunity for leaders and countries and cultures to come together and commit as one community. And I, for one, I'm looking forward to that. I think it's a very exciting 5 to 15 years to come. And we're all lucky, I think, to be here as part of this, even though it's such a challenging time. It's also a time of opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Big changes in the works. And I think, as Waddah mentioned, collaboration and coming together to set a new path, particularly in the wake of COVID, will make sort of all the difference. So I've heard a lot of great things out of this discussion. I'm really happy that we could have it. We heard about the role that technology and innovation is going to play for companies who are facing not only the question of, are they ready for that phase 2 kind of transition into low carbon technologies, but also how do they apply those tools to gain sort of the efficiencies that are necessary internally to their operations, to their upstream operations and midstream operations, thinking about shorter term planning cycles to deal with that uncertainty, and really focusing at the end of the day on the quality of the people and the assets that companies have in terms of people in order to think about adapting to these new transition. So thank you very much, Stuart and Kate, for joining us here. And I also want to thank Waddah Al-Hashmi, who had to leave a bit early. It was really a pleasure to speak with all of you. And as we continue to the next events of the Energy Meet, I'll pass it on to Melwyn.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye now. Stay safe.
Thank you very much. Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone, for your time. So that's it. Thank you.